You're coming with me." Cutter dragged Doli through the saloon doors and threw her against the bar. The paper she carried would save her people's land if 30 silent men let her keep it. Nobody moved. If you have ever felt that pull, the moment a room goes quiet and something in your chest says, "Stand up," and you look around and realize you might be the only one who feels it, stay with this one to the end, because that is exactly the moment this story turns on. Before this goes further, if you want more stories like this one, become a channel member. Tap the join button beside the channel name. It takes 10 seconds. Harrow, New Mexico Territory, in the autumn of 1879, was the kind of town that had made its peace with the way things were, and had long since stopped asking whether that peace was earned. Dust settled into the boardwalks the way old arguments settle into a marriage. Permanent, unexamined, load-bearing. It had one main street, a land office with a good coat of paint, a saloon that did honest business, and a silence about certain matters that everyone had agreed, without ever saying so aloud, to keep. The paint on that land office was new because the money behind it was new, and the money was new because in the last 8 years, quietly, parcel by parcel, a great deal of ground in this stretch of the territory had changed hands, sold off to speculators, leased to cattlemen with connections in the capital, subdivided and resold at margins that made a careful man very comfortable, and made an entire town, without anyone ever quite saying so out loud, disinclined to ask too many questions about how the paperwork had been managed. Harrow ate well because Elias Warwick worked hard, and Harrow had therefore decided, collectively and silently, that whatever Elias Warwick did to keep working hard was not really any of its business. It is a common enough arrangement in towns built on ground that used to belong to someone else, and it rarely gets examined until the morning it is forced to be. Doli had left before first light. 30 miles is a long ride for anyone. For a woman riding alone, watching the horizon for riders who might have reason to stop her, it is longer. She had spent 6 days finding what she carried, an old survey, its ink gone the soft brown of tea, folded inside oilcloth against her chest the whole way, because paper that thin does not survive a fall from a horse, and a fall from a horse was not the worst thing that could happen to her that day. She had promised her father she would be back before the 30 days ran out. She had left out the part where she would walk into a saloon to do it. There had not been a way around the saloon. The land office closed at 5. The man she needed to see was drinking in the room behind it. She had grown up on that ground, in a settlement her grandfather's grandfather had helped raise out of the same red dirt that would, in 30 days, belong to someone else entirely if she failed to reach the right man with the right paper before the deadline closed. She knew the old survey by feel before she ever unfolded it that morning, knew the exact place where the fold had softened the paper thin from being taken out and put away again, year after year, by an old man who trusted it the way other men trust a deed to a house. Riding those 30 miles, she had rehearsed, more than once, the version of this day where she failed, where the paper was not enough, where no one in Harrow would so much as look at her long enough to hear what it proved. She had made peace with that version too, the way a person makes peace with the worst outcome so that fear does not get to choose for her. It was that peace, more than courage exactly, that had let her walk through the saloon doors with her chin level and her arms already tightening around the one thing she could not afford to drop. Levi Cross had ridden into Harrow 4 hours earlier for supplies he did not urgently need, on a horse that could have used the rest, because 6 years of scouting for the United States Army teaches a man to notice things on the way into a town, whether he intends to or not. He had noticed the wagon tracks on the eastern road, fresh, heavy, cutting deep, and placed them without much effort. A federal survey party camped 2 miles east along the creek, the kind of outfit that carries its own cook and does not hurry. He had noticed the land office, freshly painted, doing more business than a town this size should generate. He had noticed, without particularly meaning to, that Harrow was a town that had recently started making money from land it had not owned 6 months before. None of it was his business. He had reminded himself of that twice already and believed it neither time. He was drinking coffee in the corner of the saloon, not whiskey, because coffee lets a man keep his eyes sharp, and his eyes had been sharp his whole life, whether he wanted them to be or not. 6 years of scouting leave a man with a particular kind of restlessness that does not go away simply because the army no longer requires it of him. He had spent those years riding beside Apache guides and interpreters, eating in their camps, bearing a friend or two along the way, learning a working stretch of their language not because a manual required it, but because a man who cannot speak to the people whose ground he is crossing is only ever a visitor to it, never anything closer. He had left the army 18 months ago with no clear plan for what came after, only the sense, which had followed him from town to town since, that he had spent 6 years learning to notice the exact kind of trouble he had just walked into today, and that noticing it and then riding on regardless had never once, in all that time, sat right with him. The doors came open hard enough to swing twice. Cutter was a big man, built for exactly this kind of work, wide through the shoulders, comfortable with his own size in a way that made him careless with other people's. He had an Apache woman by the wrist, and she was not fighting him so much as she was refusing to fall, which is its own kind of fight, quieter and harder to break. She held a bundle of papers against her chest with both arms. The way you hold something when letting go of it is simply not among the choices left to you. She did not look frightened. Levi noticed that first, before he noticed anything else about her. She looked decided, the particular calm of a person who has already done the arithmetic on what this might cost her and paid it in advance. Cutter shoved her against the bar. Glasses rattled. The bartender found something urgent to do with a rag at the far end and did not look up again. 30 men in that room, and Levi watched every one of them find a reason to study the grain of the bar top, the label on a bottle, the toe of a boot, the specific, practiced blindness of people who have decided that noticing is more dangerous than the thing itself. He had seen rooms do this before, in worse places than Harrow, and it had never once stopped meaning what it meant. Cutter tightened his grip and raised his free hand, not yet a strike, just the promise of one. The kind of gesture a man makes when he has learned that the promise usually does the whole job. Levi set his coffee down without hurrying. He crossed the room in maybe 6 strides, close enough now to see that the woman's eyes had gone to him for exactly 1 second, not pleading, just cataloging, deciding whether he was one more thing to survive or something else, before she looked back at Cutter, because a person who has decided to survive does not waste attention on hope until hope has earned it. Take your hand off her. Levi's voice did not rise. It did not need to. Cutter looked him over, dusty trail clothes, a coffee cup he'd set down without spilling it, the unbothered posture of a man who has done this kind of arithmetic before and knows exactly how it comes out. Cutter did not move his hand. Sit down, friend. This is government business. Levi's eyes did not leave him. I know what government business looks like. This is not it. Then Levi did the thing that changed the shape of the room, and did it in a language most of the men in that saloon had never heard spoken by a white man in their lives. He turned to Doli, and in halting, working Apache, the vocabulary of 6 years spent living among Chiricahua and Mescalero communities as a scout, not fluent, never fluent, but real. He wanted to know whether she was hurt. The room went the particular kind of quiet that happens when 30 men realize, all at once, that they have misjudged what kind of morning this is going to be. Doli's eyes came up to his face and stayed there a beat longer than the question required. Her answer came in English, clear enough for the whole room to hear it. I am not hurt. But something had shifted in her posture, the way a person's shoulders come down half an inch when they realize the ground under them just got a little more solid. Levi turned back to Cutter with the plain fact of it. Whatever this woman had taken from the county office, she had the legal right to access. The Territorial Citizenship Act of 1873 had extended standing to every permanent resident of this territory, Apache families included, and a man who did not know that had no business enforcing anything on behalf of anyone. Then he gave his own name and his 6 years riding scout for the United States Army in this territory and the one next door, in a voice pitched exactly loud enough for the room. Cutter's face did the arithmetic Levi had watched 100 men do before him, recalculating, finding the number came out worse than expected, and he straightened his coat with a little more dignity than the moment strictly allowed, and walked out. The doors had stopped swinging. "You speak our language," Doli ventured quietly. "Enough to know you rode a long way for something that matters." It was not quite an answer, and it was not quite a compliment, and it sat somewhere between the two long enough that neither of them moved to fill the silence right away. She studied him for a moment, not with suspicion exactly, more the careful assessment of someone deciding how much of the truth a stranger has earned in the space of one saloon. Then she made her decision, the way she seemed to make all of them, quickly and completely. "My people have 30 days. Before the land agent moves us off ground my grandfather's grandfather is buried in." Levi did not need it named for him. He had already guessed from the fresh paint on the office and the wagon tracks on the eastern road, and guessing right about ugly things was not a skill he had ever been able to turn off. They walked to the livery together, the two of them, not speaking much, and there was something in the walking itself, the matched pace, the way she did not flinch when he fell into step beside her, the way he kept half a stride back out of a courtesy that came from someplace older than manners, that the town would have noticed if the town had been the kind of place that noticed things worth noticing. At the livery she laid the oilcloth bundle on the workbench and unwrapped it with the care of a person handling something alive. It was a survey dated 1861, and it was genuinely 18 years old. The paper had that particular soft yellow that comes only from decades, not weeks, not a careful fire in a careless hand. The ink faded unevenly in the way real ink fades when it has sat through 18 summers and 18 winters in a family's keeping. In the margin, in a surveyor's careful hand, a notation. Exempt by order of the Territorial Commissioner. It named the exact boundaries of the Apache settlement land, and it excluded that ground, explicitly, by name, from anything that could ever be sold. Doli set a folded copy of a newer filing beside the old one. "There's a second survey, filed by the land agent last year. He claims it's based on this one. He claims this land was never exempted." Levi bent over both, and something in him, the part that had spent 6 years reading terrain and knew how to read a lie the same way, by what didn't sit right against what should, went very still. The newer filing was good work. He had to admit that much. Warwick had matched the language of the original almost exactly, copied its formal phrasing, even weathered the paper slightly to suggest an age it did not have. A land office clerk glancing at it for 30 seconds would have filed it without a second look. And for 8 years, apparently, that was exactly what had happened, again and again, on parcel after parcel, until an old man's careful habit of keeping his own copy folded against his chest for 18 years had finally put the original back in the same room as the fraud built to erase it. Levi traced a line with one finger, careful not to touch the old paper itself. This second one uses surveying conventions that weren't standardized until 1869, 8 years after the date on it. A man drawing an honest 1861 survey couldn't have used these marks. He wasn't born knowing the future. He looked up at her. "This doesn't just prove your land was exempted. It proves the second filing is a forgery, and it proves exactly whose hand made it." Doli's breath went out of her slow, like she had been holding it since the door of that saloon. "This unravels 8 years of his work. He will not send Cutter back alone." "No," Levi agreed. "He won't." For a moment, neither of them found anything more to add, because they both understood, without either one needing to explain it, that they had just stepped from a saloon argument into something with real teeth in it, and that whatever else was true, they were now standing on the same side of a line that a man with money and a badge of authority was about to defend very hard. Before this goes any further, if you've been with these stories for a while, you already know what tapping join beside the channel name does. It's a small thing that keeps stories like this one getting made. Thank you, if you already have. There was a plan, because Doli was not a woman who arrived at a saloon without one, even if that saloon had not been part of the plan itself. 2 miles east, camped along the creek, was a federal land commissioner named Harrow, in the territory on a routine inspection, present by nothing more than coincidence, which meant the land agent had never had the chance to buy him, flatter him, or otherwise fold him into whatever arrangement kept Harrow's silence so well maintained. Doli would ride to him directly, lay both surveys in front of him, and show him the 8-year gap hiding inside the second one. Levi would stay in Harrow and make noise, official, procedural, entirely legal noise, loud enough that the land agent would be forced to answer through his office, slowly, instead of simply sending Cutter back with more hands. Levi glanced toward the sun. 2 hours, if the commissioner's still in camp. Doli looked at him for a long moment, and there was something in that look that had nothing to do with surveys or forgeries. A question she had not put into words yet, about why a man who had known her for less than an hour was willing to plant himself between her and whatever came through that door next. Why are you doing this? Levi weighed the question longer than the answer needed, because the honest one was not a simple one, and he was not a man who gave dishonest ones. Because I was in the room, and because you didn't ask me to be. She held his eyes a second longer than the moment required, and something passed between them that neither one gave a name to. Not yet, maybe not for a long while. And then she turned for her horse. She rode east at a pace that would have worried a man who did not already know, from the way she had carried 30 miles and 30 days of fear without breaking stride, that she could carry 2 more miles at speed without difficulty. Levi watched her go until the dust settled, and then he turned back toward town, because his part of this was not finished, and a man does not get to stand still just because the woman he is protecting has ridden out of sight. Elias Warwick received the news from Cutter in the back room of the land office, and he took it the way a careful man takes bad news, without raising his voice, without moving his hands more than necessary, filing it immediately into the part of his mind that solved problems instead of the part that felt them. He was in his 50s, composed, the kind of man who dressed for the job he wanted people to believe he had, rather than the one he actually did. 8 years of careful paper had built him a reputation in this territory as a man who moved land honestly and efficiently, and 8 years is a long time to have something to lose. She has the original, Cutter said. Warwick did not answer right away. He was already 3 moves ahead, the way he had been 3 moves ahead of every objection anyone had ever raised to his work, because objections, in Warwick's long experience, were simply obstacles that had not yet met the correct paperwork. Then we go get it back, he said finally, the correct way. He reached for his leather folder, the one that had never, in 8 years, failed to open the right door, and inside it, folded with the same careful attention he gave everything, was a document he had been saving for exactly this kind of emergency. A genuine federal arrest warrant, signed by a real territorial judge, obtained months ago on the thin pretext of a records dispute, and held in reserve the way a careful man holds a spare key. It named theft of government documents. It named no one in particular yet. Warwick intended to fix that this afternoon. He had not built 8 years of careful work by panicking at the first obstacle, and he did not intend to start now. Warwick's whole method, the one that had turned quiet parcels of Apache land into a comfortable living for himself and a great many men in the territorial capital who never had to dirty their own hands with the paperwork, rested on exactly this kind of patience. Never force what could be arranged. Never argue what could simply be filed. Never leave a gap that a lawyer could not eventually fill. A woman with an old survey was, on the face of it, a minor inconvenience. The trouble, which he did not yet fully understand, was that this particular inconvenience had found herself a man in that saloon who understood paperwork exactly as well as Warwick did, and who had, unlike every other obstacle Warwick had ever quietly filed out of existence, absolutely nothing to lose by fighting him on his own ground. Back in Harrow, Levi had positioned himself where he could see both the street and the land office door, and he used the hour productively, not with a gun, which was not the tool this particular fight required, but with the slow, deliberate machinery of legal process. Because Levi Cross had learned a long time ago, scouting for an army that ran on paperwork as much as powder, that the law could be a weapon in the hands of a patient man just as easily as a shield in the hands of a guilty one. The livery door opened again, not long after, and it was not Cutter. Elias Warwick stood in the frame himself, composed, unhurried, his leather folder under one arm, like a man arriving for an appointment rather than a confrontation. He produced the warrant and laid it on the workbench beside the two surveys, and for a moment all three documents sat there together. The true one, the false one, and the one with the power to make the truth disappear into a filing cabinet forever. "Miss Doli is charged with theft of government property," Warwick said. "I'll need you to tell me where she's gone." Levi did not move toward the door, and he did not move toward Warwick, and he did not, most importantly, answer the question. He looked at the warrant for a long moment, really looked at it, the way he had once studied terrain for the one detail that would reveal whether the ground ahead would hold a man's weight or swallow him. And then he asked one question of his own. "Under what authority," he said, "does a territorial land agent execute a federal arrest warrant?" Warwick's composure held, but something behind his eyes recalculated. "My office authorizes surveying and land registration," Levi went on, before Warwick could answer. "Execution of a federal warrant requires a federal marshal, or an officer specifically deputized to act as one. Are you a deputized officer, Mr. Warwick?" There was a silence in that livery that had real weight to it, the kind that settles over a room when one man has just found the exact seam in another man's plan and pressed a finger into it. "The marshal will be here within the hour," Warwick said at last, and there was a thinness in his voice that had not been there before. "Then we will wait for the marshal," Levi said, and something about the flat certainty of it made Warwick's jaw tighten in a way 8 years of careful composure had not fully trained out of him. Warwick left to send for his lawyer and the marshal both, and the moment the door swung shut behind him, Doli slipped out the back of the livery to the horse she had left saddled in the shade. Because a plan is not a plan unless it has an exit built into it, and she had built this one before she ever laid the papers on the workbench. She looked back once, just once, at the man who had just bought her the room to disappear, and there was something in that look that carried more than gratitude in it, something neither of them had time to examine, because the hour Levi had promised her had already started counting itself down. For the next 58 minutes, Levi Cross did something that would have looked, to anyone watching from the street, like nothing at all. A man walking calmly between the county office and the land office, filing paper, waiting on clerks, asking careful questions in an unhurried voice. It did not look like a fight. It was, in fact, the only fight available to him, and he fought it with total attention. He registered a formal dispute over access rights at the county office, the kind of filing that requires a written response from someone with the authority to give one. He requested copies of the county access log for the previous 2 weeks and waited 22 minutes for a clerk who did not believe in hurrying for anyone, federal warrant or not. He submitted, in a hand steadier than he felt, a formal request for review of the original warrant filing, not to stop it, which was not in his power, but to slow it, because every hour Warwick's process took was an hour Doli's did not need to outrun. Warwick found him again at the 40-minute mark, composure fraying at the edges now, the leather folder held a little too tightly. "You are obstructing a federal warrant," he said. "I am exercising my right to register a formal dispute and request documentary review," Levi said. "Both of those are legal, Mr. Warwick. You may check with your own lawyer if you have not already." Warwick did not answer. There was nothing to answer with. The law, when used correctly, does not argue back, and Levi had learned exactly how to use it that way. More than once in that hour, Levi caught himself glancing east, toward the road Doli had ridden out on, doing the same rough arithmetic he had once done 100 times over as a scout. Distance, pace, the time a message needed to travel, and the time it needed to matter. He had no way of knowing, standing in a dusty county office, waiting on a clerk who did not believe in hurrying, whether Commissioner Hale was even still in his camp, whether the coincidence Doli was riding toward would hold, or had already slipped away with the morning. He did the only thing left to him, which was to keep filing paper as though the outcome were already certain. Because a man who lets his face show doubt in front of Elias Warwick gives Warwick something to work with. And Levi did not intend to give him anything at all. The marshal arrived at the 58-minute mark, a professional man named Briggs, who looked like he had long ago run out of patience for the particular kind of trouble land disputes generated, and considerably less enthusiasm for spending his afternoon on one now. "Where is she?" Briggs said, not quite a question, more a formality he expected Levi to fail. "I don't know her current location," Levi said, and it was, in the strictest sense, true. He genuinely did not know exactly where on the road east Doli had gotten to by then, only that she was riding it as hard as her horse would carry her. "People move." Briggs studied him for a moment with the flat, assessing look of a man who has heard 100 technically true answers in his career and recognizes one more without much surprise. And then, because there was no warrant to serve without a person to serve it to, the two of them settled onto the main street to wait, Warwick pacing a slow, furious circle nearby that neither man acknowledged. They did not have to wait long. A rider came in from the east at a pace that meant one of two things, either very bad news or very good news, because only those two kinds of news are worth killing a horse over, and this rider's horse was lathered white with the effort of it. He pulled up hard in front of the three men and handed the marshal a single folded document, out of breath, saying only, "From Commissioner Hale." He said not to wait for anything. Briggs unfolded it and read it twice, and Levi understood, before a word passed aloud, that whatever it held had landed hard. It was a federal stay order, signed by Commissioner Hale himself, and it did three things at once, each of them with the flat finality of federal authority overruling territorial ambition. It stayed the relocation of the Apache settlement, effective immediately, pending a full investigation into the conflict between the 1861 and 1878 surveys. It directed the marshal's office to preserve every document involved in that conflict, the true and the false both, under federal custody, and it suspended Elias Warwick from his duties as land agent, effective immediately, pending the outcome of that review. "That order has no authority to suspend a warrant signed by a territorial judge," Warwick said, and his voice had lost, for the first time all day, the composure that 8 years of careful work had built into it. Briggs did not look up from the paper. "Commissioner Hale's federal authority supersedes territorial judicial authority in matters under federal land office jurisdiction," he said, flat, final, the voice of a man reading a fact rather than offering an opinion. "The warrant is suspended pending review." Warwick opened his mouth and then, for perhaps the first time in 8 years of always having the correct paperwork, found that he did not. "Mr. Warwick," Briggs said, folding the order back into its creases, "you are suspended from your duties, effective immediately. I'd advise you not to leave the territory before the federal review concludes." Warwick said nothing at all. There was, for once, nothing left in the folder that would have helped him. Doli rode back into Harrow that evening with the low sun behind her, and something in the way she sat the saddle carried the whole story to the street before she'd spoken a single word of it. The particular ease of a person who has been carrying a weight for 30 days and has finally set it down. Commissioner Hale, she said, had needed only 10 minutes with the two surveys laid side by side to reach his conclusion. "This one is genuine," he had told her, "and this one is not. And I have done this work long enough in this territory to know the difference by the paper alone before I ever get to the ink." He had not needed the 8-year gap in the surveying conventions explained to him twice. Word travels fast in a town the size of Harrow, and by the time Doli's horse had cooled at the livery, the street had already begun to fill with a different kind of quiet than the one the saloon had held 2 days before. Not the silence of 30 men choosing not to see, but something closer to shame catching up with itself a day late. A few of the men who had studied the grain of the bar top so carefully found reasons to be out on the boardwalk that evening, watching her ride in, saying nothing, which was its own kind of apology, even if none of them had the nerve to make it out loud. Doli did not appear to need it. She had not ridden 30 miles and then 2 more for an apology. Levi asked her the only question that still mattered. When does the stay expire? Doli looked at him, and for the first time since the saloon doors had opened that morning, something in her face allowed itself to soften all the way, no longer decided in the hard, bracing way of a woman expecting the worst, but something gentler, something that had room in it now for more than survival. It doesn't, she said. It holds until the federal investigation concludes. There's no clock on it anymore. That was the answer that mattered more than any other word spoken that day, and they both stood with it for a moment in the dust of the street, not needing to fill the silence, the way two people who have just come through something together sometimes don't. If this story is the kind you come back for, the quiet ones where nobody needed a wedding or a promise to prove what mattered, just a man who stood up and a woman who never let go of what she was carrying, that is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell, and becoming a member is the simplest way to help it keep telling them. Tap join beside the channel name if you'd like to. Levi stayed in Harrow one more night, though there was no longer any legal reason that required it, and if anyone had asked him why, he might not have had a better answer than the one he had already given her once. Because he was in the room, and because nobody had asked him to be. And somewhere in the space between those two things, a man sometimes finds a reason of his own that he is not yet ready to say out loud. He and Doli sat that evening on the low fence outside the livery, not saying a great deal, the kind of quiet that only happens between people who have already spoken the important things without needing all the words. She shared with him a little about her father, about the 30 families who would sleep that night on ground that was, for the first time in a month, no longer counting down. When she finally wondered aloud, he gave her a little of the 6 years that had taught him her language, not the whole of it, because some things a man carries alone for a reason, but enough that she understood the shape of what had brought him. 4 hours before a saloon door swung open to exactly the town and the moment where he was needed. Neither of them reached for more than that. It was not, either of them seemed to understand without saying so, the kind of thing that needed hurrying. That night, word reached the settlement 30 miles west by a rider sent ahead for exactly that purpose. And Doli's father heard, before he heard almost anything else, that his daughter had ridden the whole distance alone, walked into a saloon full of strangers, and come out the other side of it with the land still theirs. He would not sleep well that night either, in a different way than the 30 nights before it, the particular sleeplessness of relief, which keeps a person awake turning over what almost happened long after the danger itself has passed. Doli would not hear the details of that night until she rode home herself, but she carried some sense of it with her anyway, standing in Harrow under a sky just starting to go gray at the edges, the way a person carries the shape of home, even from 30 miles off. In the morning, Levi loaded his horse at the livery while the town was still mostly asleep, and Doli came to see him off, standing in the same doorway where she had first laid the surveys out 2 days before. "My father will want to know your name," she said. Levi checked the girth strap on his saddle twice, which was not strictly necessary, but gave him a moment to find the words he wanted. "He doesn't need my name," he said finally. "He needs the document to stay safe until the review's finished. That's the part that matters." "That isn't an answer to what I asked," Doli said, and there was something almost like a smile in it, the first he had seen from her since the saloon, and it changed her whole face in a way he found himself wanting to remember for longer than the ride west was likely to allow him to forget it. "Why did you stand up?" she asked him then, the real question, the one she had circled twice already without quite landing on it. "In that saloon, you didn't know me." Levi looked at her for a long moment, and this time he did not check the girth strap or find something else to do with his hands. "I knew enough," he said. It was, in its way, the truest thing he had said to her since the moment the doors had first swung open, and they both seemed to understand that it meant considerably more than the 4 words strictly carried. Doli held his eyes, and neither of them moved to close the distance between them, because that was not, either one seemed to understand without saying it aloud, a thing this morning was for, but something had been said all the same, in the way two people sometimes say the largest things without using the words built to carry them, and it would sit between them, unspent but not forgotten, for longer than either was likely to admit. Doli did not move to close the space between them, and Levy did not either, though both of them felt, in that small silence, exactly how little space there actually was left to close. "You could ride west with the rest of us instead," she said finally, quieter than anything else she had said to him. "If you wanted somewhere to be for a while." It was not quite an invitation and not quite not one, and Levy held it in his chest a moment, the way he had held her language in his chest for 6 years, carefully, without quite knowing yet what he would do with it. "Maybe I will," he said, "one day if the road brings me back this way." It was not a promise, and they both understood that it was not, but it was not nothing either. And for two people who had known each other 2 days over a stolen document and a saloon full of silence, it was perhaps exactly the right size of thing to leave between them. He swung up into the saddle and rode west out of Harrow, with the morning still cool, and the road ahead of him empty in the particular way a road looks when a man does not yet know where it is taking him, only that it is taking him somewhere he has not been before. 2 miles out, a young rider came alongside him at speed, Apache, maybe 17, moving with the easy competence of someone who had grown up on this ground and belonged to it the way Levi, for all his years scouting it, never fully had. The young man said nothing at first, simply matched Levi's pace for a moment, then reached across and pressed a folded scrap of paper into his hand before wheeling east again without a backward glance, gone as quickly as he had arrived. Levi unfolded it at a walk, the high desert opening wide and pale around him in every direction, Harrow already small behind. 3 words, written in Apache, in an unpracticed hand, the hand of someone who had learned to write them specifically for this purpose. "We remember you." He read them twice, and then he sat with them a while longer than reading required, the road west still ahead of him, and 30 miles further on, past ground he would probably never see again, 30 families sleeping tonight on land that had not moved, because a young woman had ridden 30 miles alone and had refused, in a saloon full of men who had chosen not to notice her, to let go of what she was carrying. He folded the paper carefully and put it against his chest, inside his coat, the way she had once carried her own papers against hers, and he sat the saddle differently for the rest of that ride than he had sat it riding in 4 days before. Like a man who had spent a long time carrying something at a wrong angle without quite knowing it, some old weight from 6 years of scouting a war that had never fully let him go, and had finally, without entirely meaning to, found the place where it settled level. He did not know, riding west that morning, whether the road would ever bring him back through Harrow again. He knew only that some part of him had been left there anyway, folded into 3 words in a language he had spent 6 years learning for reasons he had never fully understood until the day a saloon door swung open and a woman looked at him like he was one more thing to survive, and then, later, like he was not. If a stranger standing up when it costs him nothing to sit back down is the kind of story you want more of, this channel is built for exactly that. Subscribe, and you won't miss the next one. And if you've made it this far, tell us in the comments, would you have stood up in that saloon or found a reason, like the other 30 men, to study the grain of the bar instead? We read every one.